Drodzy Pani I Panowie, dear friends and partners of Heinrich Böll Foundation. My name is Ellen Ueberschär. I'm president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here for the first time. I mean, from my side for the first time. I stepped into my job 2 years ago, and unfortunately last year I wasn't able to participate in this really important and wonderful format. I would like to start welcoming a number of high-ranking guests. The German ambassador, Rolf Nickel, welcome, Mr. Nickel. We are pleased to have you here. And I like to welcome the co-president of the Polish Greens, Marek Kosakowski. And congratulations again to having at least 3 members of parliament now and same. And a warm welcome to Manuel Sarrazin, who is member of parliament, and he is really dedicated to the Polish-German dialogue issues. Welcome, Manuel. Moreover, of course, I would like to thank the team of our Warsaw office here in Warsaw, and of course the team of European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, for having prepared this conference so carefully. And thanks go especially to Gosia Kopka and the ECFR's head or president, Piotr Buras. Thank you both for brilliant, as you're standing there, so one can really see how brilliant you have been cooperating. Thank you very much for that. But of course, this is a special occasion we want to use for saying farewell to our outgoing office director and welcoming our incoming office director, but to these issues later on. The World in Focus conference takes place since 2016, the 4th time now, in partnership with the city of Warsaw, and this year also with the University of Warsaw, and I appreciate very much to have the chance to have the conference in these wonderful rooms. What is so special about this conference is that it's not held only amongst experts, but for the broader public. One of the former German Bundeskanzlers once said, where there is no discussion in a democracy, there is no democracy. This conference serves as a space for such kind of democracy to discuss current and pressing issues like climate change and the status of the international institutions, Poland within the European Union, and whether there is a European life, and if yes, what is it like, this European way of life? We want to discuss, and we need discussions to keep up with democracy, to develop democracy, and to ensure democratic open debate. The World in Focus conference thus became rather a festival of international politics, a space to discuss, to reflect, to be inspired. For the 4th time, we will take a trip across countries and continents, always referring back to questions about Poland's participation in global challenges and decision-making processes. This year, we will focus on possible alliances in a period of change. Multilateralism, you know all these issues. Multilateralism is in a crisis. Think tanks even ponder the withdrawal of the US from NATO. The French president has its own opinion on this alliance. The UN, and especially its core, the Security Council, has turned into a council of insecurity and left the UN in a deadlock. At the same time, we desperately need international law to be enforced. We need reliable partners around the globe to combat climate crisis. We need fair and free trade to mitigate inequalities, to name just a few of these big challenges. And first and foremost for us, we need the European Union that sticks to its core values as laid down in the treaties: human dignity, freedom, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. After the European elections, we observed a process of building a new European Commission that was marked already by the cleavages within our societies, within our countries. The creative and for Brussels ears unusual naming of the portfolios by the new president, Ursula von der Leyen, raised already a lot of concerns that right-wing populist forces gained more influence on the agenda of the Commission. Especially the new created portfolio under the title Protection of Our European Way of Life, entailing a rather unusual mix of responsibility from education, culture, sports to integration, migration and security, raised the question, why is it under threat and from whom? Greens in the European Parliament unmasked the idea to link such a thing as European way of life to migration as a dog whistle of the far right that will fuel this we or us against them way of life that is preferred by those who see Europe as a fortress. The newly appointed protector-in-chief of the European way of life, Margaritas Schinas, obviously has been trying to dispel the doubts about his mission, and perhaps the pure fact that he is from Greece, the cradle of democracy, and graduated from the College of Europe in Bruges, might partially mitigate the concerns. Recently, he referred to the European way of life as a culture of dialogue and compromise. But that is not enough when European governments are chipping away women's rights, dismantle the rule of law, keep migrants as prisoners, and create new traditional and family values. We will discuss that later on. This year, just to remind us, we commemorate 30 years of peaceful revolution, and the Polish way of freedom served as a role model for people to whom I belong for the DDR civil rights movement. The Polish Roundtable, which is rebuilt so impressive at the Solidarność Center in Gdansk, became a symbol of liberation, of peaceful change. 30 years after, we see Poland often in the very center of European debates on rule of law, on free media, on liberal democracy, torn between East and West, between nationalism and European integration, between liberalism and illiberalism. How do these things belong together? Do we learn from history, and is history always the best guide to master the challenges of the future? As I mentioned before, where there is no discussion, there is no democracy. So let's start and take on to discuss and take the world into our focus, SWOT pod lupa. And I'm looking forward to all the discussions tonight, to this discussion. And now I hand over to Piotr Buras, and thank you again for this cooperation.
Dziękuję bardzo, Ellen. Witam Państwa bardzo.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome you warmly. Good evening. It's already dark. I'm really glad to be able to see you today. World in Focus is a joint effort of the European Council for Foreign Relations and Heinrich Böll Foundation. We came up with the idea of the World in Focus together with Irene Hahn 4 years ago. And the aim of this event is to conduct a debate on European politics, not only a debate by experts, but also by broader audience. And as Ellen said, we always have one leading item on the agenda. This year, this is alliances or international cooperation, or cooperation in a broad sense, because we've been talking a lot about populism, egoism, nationalism. In today's world, in our societies, communities, everyone's thinking about oneself, and we would like to think about how to build cooperation, how to strike a consensus. And today we'll talk about whether it is possible to build a consensus around the notion of the European style of life, which has become an important topic on the European agenda lately. But tomorrow we would also like to talk about other kinds of cooperation. For instance, when it comes to climate, is it possible for France and Germany to strike a balance when it comes to the future of the European Union? We will also talk about whether China is a threat for our cooperation, for the international order only, or is it rather possible to include China in the cooperation. But we are not naive, and tomorrow we are going to talk about the fact that cooperation has a different dimension as well. There will be a panel discussion on the cooperation of Kremlin with the extreme right, which is also a very important topic. So I would like to invite you to all the debates today and tomorrow. Tomorrow we are starting at 10 a.m. And now I'd like to invite you to the first panel discussion about the European model of life. Does it exist? Should we defend it? And I would like to invite to the stage, to the chairs in front of the room, I would like to invite Sylvie Kauffmann from Le Monde. Good evening. Manuel Sarrazin, who's been introduced already, Green politician, leader of the Polish-German parliamentary group, who needs interpretation, and Ziemowit, Szczerek, last but not least, a writer, who's well known in Poland, author of books, Międzymorze, Karpaty, and a couple of other books. Good evening.
Teraz będzie mnie słychać.
Now I hope you can hear me. The European lifestyle is a notion that has been very successful in the last weeks or months. Ueberschär mentioned that in her introduction. I would like to approach the topic moving away slightly from the discussion that has recently taken place around the new mandate, new term of the new commissioner and the new European Commission. Let's move away from that. I'm thinking to myself that since 1989, we've had the conviction that the European lifestyle, whatever we understand by that notion, we believe that there's this European model that can be spread, that will transform our surroundings, our international environment, our neighborhood, that would become ever more popular in the world and would be proof of the attractiveness and strength of Europe. And to a certain extent, indeed, history has proven us right. If we look from the perspective from the 90s, well, the expansion of the European Union has been a successful example. The European model was wildly successful, popular, and is still so in post-Soviet countries and in the Balkans and probably beyond. And yet, looking at the situation as it is, as of today, the situation is to a certain extent quite opposite to what we saw in the 90s. That is, it is not Europe that transforms the international surroundings with the strength of its model, of its example, by setting an example. Rather, it undergoes influence, impact from a series of phenomena like migration, climate change, and others. So ever less are we talking of spreading the European model, and ever more often are we talking about protecting this model as a delicate plant against strong wind. This might be where the new commissioner comes from in the new commission. But the question I'd like to ask my panelists is the following. If we are to defend this European model, do we precisely know what we should be protecting, what indeed is the object of these examples of aggression, attacks from the outside, and what is the core of this European model that is necessary for Europe to continue and to prevail? And the other question is whether we agree on that, whether we are capable of communicating efficiently between the East and West of the EU about what the European model is, and if there is such a consensus, is it deeper or is it shallower than it was 10 or 30 years ago? I think that to many this question might be a rhetoric one, since we seem to be far away from such a consensus. So, Sylvie Kauffmann, let me ask you the following. She's a commentator at Monde, and she's an expert on Europe, Western Europe, but also Eastern Europe. She has been writing recently a lot about what has been going on in the last 30 years in Central Eastern Europe, the legacy of 1989, etc. So I would like to ask you about how you explain the fact of what happened in the last 15 years, let's say, since the expansion of EU, or maybe from the 1989 events. What about this consensus? Has it become weaker? Is it strong, or has it become a conflict rather than a consensus about what this European model, lifestyle model, is that we are supposed to protect?
Okay, yeah. Dobry wieczór. First of all, thank you for inviting me here. I'm very happy. Gazeta told me it's the 4th year I'm coming to Świat pod lupą, and it's always a pleasure to be here. Your question, of course, is extremely important and also very, very interesting, because it's a question we never thought, I think, in 1989 that we would ask ourselves. Those who were here at that time. And first, just one thing, when you say East-West, I think I disagree with this assumption that it's an East-West divide. I think it looks, at some stage it looked, and there are, of course, differences between East-West, but I think the divide is also among our societies, both in Central Europe and in Western Europe. So, but I guess we'll come back to this. On the legacy of 1989, what I think it's very, very interesting to look at this 30 years later, because there are a lot of things that we didn't see at the time and that people who were actors then now can reflect on and understand much better. And I think it's quite a fascinating exercise to talk to people who can look back now and think about what has happened. First, I think in 1989 or in those years, what did communist societies know about the West, about Western Europe? I think they idealized what the West was. For people here, the West was, I mean, when I say the West, I would say maybe Western Europe. It was freedom compared to oppression. It was political pluralism opposed to one-party system. It was wealth and high standards of living compared to shortages and, very, very low standards of living. And of course, it was not as simple as this, but they didn't know. And, last year I talked to Anna Shabatova in Prague. Anna Shabatova was a member of Charter 77. Her father was one of the leaders of the Prague Spring, so she was involved in really very active opposition. One of the few Czechoslovaks who was involved in very active opposition, along with Václav Havel, and now she's the ombudsman of the Czech Republic. And she said, in those times for us there was no illiberal or liberal democracy. There was democracy, period. That's all. These were not questions that people were asking themselves. So there was one model, in a way, that existed. We also thought, probably in the West, that there was only one model of democracy. And so that model was applied because both sides wanted it. We thought it was the best model, and people in Central Europe, in communist societies also, the majority of people also were longing for this model. And so I think that's what Ivan Kastev means when he talks about this imitation process. There's also an American historian, Mary Elise Sarot, who wrote a lot about 1989 and the aftermath, and she talks about this prefab model, which I think it's also a good image, because she says this was the model we knew. It was a prefab model, and we just transferred it to the East. We didn't try to make any effort of imagination. So the West kind of universalized its experience, right? And I think we also in the West idealized parts of the opposition here, or what was going on in the mind of what became the new democratic elite. We assumed that everybody was like Václav Havel or Bronek Geremek. And of course, for instance, we were completely blind to the Kaczynskis. We didn't know there were differences between them from the West. John Paul II was a hero to everybody. When it became clear afterwards that he was so conservative on social values, we were kind of surprised. So all these nuances and differences came out in the following years, and I think the Western Europe is now coming to terms with the fact that there are different paths to democracy. There are different experiences also within societies. Another Central European intellectual told me, you went through the 1968 revolutions. May 1968 in France was a moment of massive social liberation, of emancipation, socially. 1968 in Prague was a terrible moment of repression. So when there was this very big rift on immigration and on the refugee crisis in 2015 and 16, there was a lot of incomprehension in Western Europe, because we were shocked about the reaction mostly in these countries. But if you really look at the experiences we went through over the past decades, you can also, I think now, a few years later, we understand a bit better. So I think we're still going through this process of understanding that we have been going through different paths, and that we have to put them closer, bring them closer to agree on this European model. To go back to your original question, this is most striking probably in Germany, because Germany had the East inside it. So, from France, for instance, or from Italy, it's a different. We have different views. So I would love to hear your perspective on this. But I think that there is now some reflection in Western Europe about why we have these differences, and also because we have these differences inside our own societies, and we have these political challenges with populist parties and leaders and even voters. So now the consensus today, I think it still has to be built, but if we are supposed to stay united inside Europe, we will have to agree on a few criteria, and some of them, I think we can make compromises on some social issues, because we understand that some of us need more time or a different pace to reach some objectives, but there are other criteria or values that there can be no compromise, and I think the rule of law and freedom of expression are definitely some of them. Because if we don't all agree about these fundamental values, there's no point in having a European Union.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sylvie. And I will. You asked Manuel to present the German perspective, but I will come to Manuel in a second. And first, I would like to ask a question to Ziemowit in Polish, if you allow me. Mówiła Sylvie.
Sylvie mentioned these differences in perspective, this erroneous view of East in the West and the West in the East. When one reads your books which are extremely in-depth reports from journeys across Central Eastern Europe, the Balkans, one might have the impression that this is really quite a separate universe, a different world, a world apart, and that this Central Europe is indeed very different. So my question would be the following. At a political level, at least, is there a difference or a conflict within the EU between the East and the West? Has this been a historical necessity after this period of imitation and superficiality as presented by Sylvie, based on a wrong view of the partners? Now it is the time of these differences, these nightmares, emerging at last. Or might things go quite differently? Are we still capable of building a consensus, agreement about what European character, Europeanity is? Each region is different. And European periphery is also different one from the other. There are southern peripheries that have not necessarily been going hand in hand with the European values. We are a different kind of periphery. And yet, what's important is to not orientalize these peripheries. Let's not demonize these peripheries. Let's not make them ununderstandable. Because, let's be frank, everything that takes place in Eastern Europe is quite understandable, clear, and obvious. Applying these mystical and mysterious features and to pretend that you cannot grasp something with logical mind does not make sense. It's like with Russia. You have to understand the country with your mind at last. Looking at the European map, including the periphery, for a very long time it has been clear that a kind of this besieged fortress effect has to take place. If the relative wealth in Europe is added to the mixture with the regions around it, Africa, Middle East, Eastern Europe, the climate crisis that might make many of these territories might find it difficult to go on, so a lot of people will have to migrate. Then it becomes obvious that these people will start moving towards the West, towards Europe. And it's been obvious that this is the point where we are going to have this syndrome of besieged fortress, and it's obvious that it's not liberal democracy, yet it's the democracy of terror that rules in such a fortress. So if you add to that the tendency of a rich center, rich core, whether it's the Central European part of the EU, the core of the old EU, or the metropolis, you will see that what's dominant is that what dominates are needs based on the Maslow pyramid. So the most basic needs are going to prevail, regardless of whether it's Paris or Warsaw or Budapest. Both in Warsaw and Budapest is the conservatives that rule, and yet they're liberals. So it's obvious that the whole region, the whole Eastern Europe is a periphery that finds it more difficult than the European core, and this makes it obvious that at the moment of terror, of fear, this is the region that is going to pick up this approach. Let me leave it at that and stress once again that this is all quite obvious, but resolvable. And it can indeed be grasped by the human mind. Now, talking about these two parts of Europe looking at one another with this idealistic image, having this idealistic image. To a certain extent, yes, but the West was afraid of this Eastern Europe being so religious when solidarity, when Solidarność was starting to gain momentum. Those that fled to the West also talked about the social relations in the West not being so perfect either. So I wouldn't like to make things too simple, oversimplified. Because at the end of the day, the consensus is achievable. But we might be approaching the matter quite wrongly. For example, we are convinced that we should deal with certain fears, but not necessarily in the right way. They should be dismantled instead of making them a partner in the dialogue. We tend to give them the status of an ideology. I'm generally talking about the right now. We don't understand anymore what's right-wing in the right narrative, and we don't understand what's really pure populism. We shouldn't be fighting against what's right-wing, we should be fighting what's populist.
Sarrazin, a lot has been already said, so you certainly have your own thoughts which you would like to share, but I would like to add, nevertheless, and one question or even two. One is that, when I listen to Sylvie and Dziennik, I had the feeling that perhaps it is not. I mean, we are focusing not in this conversation, but in the European debate as well. I think very much on this East-West divide. But maybe this is not the key cleavage which we have, and maybe we should look, differently at this challenge of defining a European model or defining a consensus around it. But nevertheless, I think it is worth asking. There are some tensions between East and West. I think we shouldn't deny it. But to what extent is the West responsible for that? To what extent do you think you in the West have made some mistakes over the last 15, 30 years in the, in your approach to Central Eastern Europe, which may to some extent explain what's happening here? Or is it just genuine for the reasons, genuinely, Central Eastern European, for the reasons which have been partly explained by Ziemowit? Manuel.
Yeah, so I would totally agree on that. The cleavage within the European Union is not between the East and the West, but it's a really good pattern for both sides, so to say, in political terms, to use this cleavage to explain why things are blocked, especially when you don't want them on your own. So to believe that the French government really wanted to have a more open border migration policy, or the German Grand Coalition really wanted to have open borders so much, it was quite a good thing, I think, for the Grand Coalition not to having to quarrel about a quota system on refugees, which is really, really strictly and really, really would have big numbers with visa policy and real open migration policy, but to say that, oh, the stupid Poles and Hungarians, they are so stupid, they don't want it, sorry, we cannot go further. I don't think that we would have got a deal between Spain, France and Germany, or even within the Grand Coalition in Germany, on a real modern migration, open borders policy, even if we hadn't Poland and Hungary in the European Union. By the way, Poland was voting in favor of the timely bound mechanism for separating the refugees, and by the way, Germany only took half of the number which has been agreed in the end. So less than a half of the whole 160,000 has been brought around the European Union after this 3 years' time. So it's quite obvious that the Commission was the driving force behind it. Sometimes the German government was saying it, but it was not an East-West divide only. Also, Western member states were clearly against a permanent mechanism. If you ask me about this, some more things, I mean, there are a lot of models you can say, where is the border of Eastern Europe to... I don't believe that there is Eastern Europe existing. I believe in Central Europe, but this is ideology. But some people say it's the border between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. Some people say it's the Iron Curtain. Some people say we're the losers in football, we're the winners. Okay, this is in Poland hard to say, yeah, because you always think you might win next time and then you lose. So this is quite British way of life. But I would say perhaps there's one border which is totally underestimated. If you look at the map of Europe, you had a lot of countries which were colonizing around the globe, yeah, even like Sweden, big colonial power, Denmark, big colonial power, Netherlands, France, Germany to a certain extent, Italy, and then you had countries who were colonized. And I mean, if you make this as a pattern of Central Europe, perhaps you would see that Finland, or also Poland, or also Ukraine, have been suffering and had to create a nation as a kind of liberation from an imperium which was actually colonial. And if you now look at the typical approach of Mr. Macron, for example, but also some German politicians to this region, we start with this classical arrogancy, which is immediately bringing such societies in the rage of, so then no, better not, you know. And this is the biggest mistake. The biggest mistake is perhaps not even the content, but the sound of approaching to the societies. I believe certainly that if Mr. Steinmeier in 2015, when he was a foreign minister of Germany, hasn't said that if the Poles don't agree on this quota system, then they will not get any more money from cohesion funds. If he hasn't said so, the outrage in Poland would have not been so positive for the PiS government in campaign against for the later PiS government as opposition in campaign to the Platforma government, which was then in place. So I think this is the one point which is really important. Second question about European way of life. I mean, I think this is fitting to a certain extent on that. If you really ask me what is in the end, the essence, the most important point about the European model, It is quite simply that the European model is that we fight about each single euro or cent with 28 heads of state until to the last moment, and it's the biggest, worst procedure on earth which you can imagine, and nobody wants to give anything, everybody wants to grab all, and it's horrible. But in the end, it's clear, if something really bad is happening, we will stick together, we don't know why. And this we don't know why is political will. And if you now look what happened in the last 5 or 10 years, that the credibility of this, whatever will happen in the end, we will stick together somehow because there's political will, this has been diminished. This has been diminished by German positioning in the Euro crisis, not because of they didn't want to pay too much, but because of saying, oh, we could kick Greece out. I don't think that this austerity point was decisive, but to say, oh, let's kick them out point, yeah. It has been diminished also by French position now regarding Albania and North Macedonia, for example, so that suddenly, also for the big players who were usually the partners for saying, we make a compromise somehow, a bad compromise, but we will stick together, suddenly they say, no, not with me, veto. Small countries like Hungary, they can make vetoes, that's not relevant. But when France or Germany are, giving the face, not having the face anymore, that in the end we will always find a deal, Germany will pay some euros and then everybody will fine. And, even the crisis you cannot imagine will be solved somehow because we will stick together. I think this is the problem which we see. And the second point is that the classical ways of integration are not all functioning anymore. The classical way of integration was negative integration, positive integration by law, by courts, you all know this stuff. And then you have new topics coming up, and the states gained the power of deciding about them, always on the level that the bosses are talking. So always Angie is talking to Manuel, and this is not functioning. So the next point is the European way was the Commission is getting more important, supranational institutions getting more important. Those guys who are these technocrats in Brussels, who have the European sake in their heart, they get more important. And we have the different way. Since 2010, since the Lisbon Treaty, since the Euro crisis, suddenly the member states, the capitals want to be more important, and we see that this is not functioning usually. So this is technical arguments in European way of life. Usually you would say it's like freedom or democracy or stuff, but this pragmatism of Europe, this got lost to a certain extent, and everybody is going home and saying like, I'm the harsh guy in European level to play good in the hometown. And suddenly they forget about, in the end, they have to make a deal in Brussels as well. And this is why Europe is less efficient. And this in a time where other political models, like Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, is showing that I have an efficient model. I just send some drones, and then perhaps I bomb or not. And suddenly, you vote for me, and I can change the world quite easy because I have this power. And the European model was always different, and now we are weakened in this because we're not able to be efficient anymore. And we are weakened also because some people see that, I make a small war in Syria, and afterwards Mr. Macron is saying, Russia is not the threat, it's terrorism, because I'm mighty, I'm powerful. And I would say that these are the aspects where our model is weakened.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manuel, and also for your remark about this illusionary nature of this East-West divide, because but also about its usefulness for both sides to instrumentalize this device for political reasons. And I was struck a little bit by Ursula von der Leyen's comments, which she made in one of her speech at the very beginning of her, not yet term, but after she was nominated the head of the European Commission, when she said that she would make sure that the Commission is will try to bridge this East-West divide. And she even went further and said that, democracy is not working perhaps very well in the east of Europe, but it's actually, but our West European democracies are not perfect either. So, as if she was basically replicating this kind of thinking that this is all about East-West, so my question for Sylvie is it? Do you think is it a useful approach? Or can the Commission bridge this divide, or should it focus on something completely different?
Whether the Commission can bridge this divide, I don't know. We have to see. It's just starting.
Oh, try to support.
It should definitely try. I think it's also the job of the President of the European Council now, Charles Michel. I'm not sure Donald Tusk was very successful at this. In some way, he illustrated this divide himself, but we'll see. I mean, I think what is important also is that there is an awareness now that that this effort has to be made, because the European leaders or the leaders of each country who would go to Brussels saying, I'm going to do this, to summits or to European councils in Brussels, and before they leave Paris or probably Berlin or Rome, they say, I'm going to Brussels and I'm going to fight for this, and I will, and then if they don't succeed in getting an agreement, they come back home and they say, this is the fault of Brussels. It's always, if you succeed, it's the national leader success, but if you fail, it's always Brussels' failure. So this, I think, every country leader knows how to deal with this. But what is now more, I think, first, we can see that these situations when they are blocked, like what happened with the crisis on the refugee quotas. This, I think, the awareness is that it has to be avoided at all costs. So it has, there are more efforts to do on consensus. And there is a new situation, which is 3-4 years ago, when the referendum of Brexit was, when the British voted for Brexit, whatever they thought it meant, that's another issue. There was this fear that, there would be Grexit and Frexit and Polexit and whatever. This hasn't materialized. So the threat now is not so much that the disintegration of the EU. The threat is more that every member state is defining its interest in a narrower and narrower way, and so that leaves less and less common space in Brussels to find, common to work for the European common good. So I think this is the new situation also, that there are more people. There are 27 member states around the table. They want to stick together because they know it's very cold outside, and there's China and there's Russia and there's the US, which is not the way it used to be, and so there's this feeling that we have to stay together. But what do we want to do together? And that we come back to your first question: what is this? On what can we build this consensus? And what? So this is really, I think, the challenge also now is not only how do we work together, but for what objective? And I think this Commission has quite a few interesting goals in terms of, for instance, building a digital, a coherent digital policy, on trade. Trade is a powerful instrument also to communicate values. You were talking about Europe as a transformative power. Trade is an instrument to be a transformative power, because when you negotiate a trade deal, you can put as conditions some of your environmental criteria or social values for workers or whatever. But we have to work, that leaves the question open. What do we want to do together?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Sylvie. I would like Manuel to think about this question, because I will address it to him in a second as a politician responsible for, having good answers. And I will also ask you in a second about what are the main threats to this European model, and how should we actually defend ourselves against those threats. But before we come to you, I will ask Ziemowit another question, because in one of his recent commentaries written, I think after this independence march in Warsaw, organized by nationalists, you wrote that these are the people who, if things go wrong, they will take the power. And that we can of course dispute if this analysis is right or wrong, but my point is a different one. One thing which is interesting in this debate, intellectual debate about the post-89, is also the point made by Ivan Krastev in his book with Stephen Holmes, referring to Orban's words, who basically said that, look, we imitated the Western model in the 90s, but now we are the model. So there is a sort of an alternative modernity, an alternative model of Europeanness, alternative model of political system, alternative model of democracy, and if we take the Polish debate into the picture, there is perhaps it is also there. There is references, for example, to the Christian roots of the European integration projects, which needs to be rediscovered, and that this is so. There is what is in the air is there is a certain new idea, alternative idea of Europe, of alternative idea of democracy. So the question to Ziemowit is, to what extent you think this idea can be successful in Europe, and upon what conditions?
Well, in general, I would like to warn you that if we do not present a counter-narrative versus the narrative of besieged fortress, and a narrative that refers to traditional conservative values, then we might have the same situation as in Arab countries, where, well, we were happy then the Arab Spring was there because the aim of the spring was to introduce changes in those authoritarian states and was supposed to introduce democracy in those countries. But it turned out there were no mechanisms in those countries to accept democracy, and it turned out that extremist Islamists had mechanisms to be successful. ISIS was created, and so on and so forth. So if democracy has no contra-narrative, we need pragmatism, as Sarrazin mentioned. If we don't have any catchy phrases, and that's also something that Donald Tusk mentioned when he talked about Bono coming to him and saying that he should be more melodramatic or something like that. But, well, yes, I was listening carefully to the speech of von der Leyen. I was listening very carefully to the speech of Michel, and, well, trade, new technologies, okay, fine. These are good things. In the framework of all those debates taking place in Europe, for instance, in the European People's Party, in the European Parliament, there was a debate on the European Union becoming more politicized. But still, I believe this is not a narrative which will address some basic human fears, and I think we ignore those fears. We think they are something which can be intellectualized. So if there is someone who says that in the face of new social changes caused by migration, he fears that his position will become weaker and will not satisfy him, then automatically we say, well, he's lost, he's traditionalist, he's fascist. But in fact, that's something where there is a betrayal of the left, because if there are any social fears, they are grounded. They have certain roots, and the root is the fact that people fear certain things, they fear instability, and so on and so forth. And if the left is not able to address these fears, then those people go to populists who address their fears. And I understand that from the point of view of Brussels and the center of Europe, such fears are unfounded. Well, I do believe in that. I do believe that people who live in multicultural societies, they do not have such fears. But let's face the situation in Germany. The Alternative für Deutschland is so popular not only in Eastern Europe, not only there. Where is Pegida successful? Let's look at where Pegida is successful. That's also something that's very telling for us. The pragmatic center needs to take these people to their teams.
Okay, Manuel, if you allow.
Sorry?
If Manuel allows.
No, I will be short. No, you talked about the left and the counter-narrative. I agree with you. We need but this is one of also the big failures of the past 30 years. Where are the social democrats? You know, they've collapsed almost everywhere. They were the big hope of the 90s. At the end of the 90s, they were ruling Europe. I mean, I think out of 15 member states at that time, 13 were ruled by a social democratic government. And now, you know, in France, the Socialist Party is 6%. You know, and I'm not going to do the list of all the countries because it's... yeah, well, that's interesting, you're right. But what I mean is that there's been a vacuum of ideas. Yes, we do need a counter-narrative, but so far it's... I hope some people are working on this, but it's but it's you know it's very much a work in progress. And about the alternative model, what I find interesting also is that there was this fear of this right-wing, far-right network. When Steve Bannon came on the European side, we thought, on the European scene, we thought, that's it, you know, he's going to unite all those Marine Le Pen and AfD and all this of Europe, and it's going to... this didn't materialize. I mean, each of those movements is powerful in the national borders, but there's no international of the far right so far in Europe. You know, it's interesting, I think. Well, Orban is working on it, but I don't think he's succeeding very well, you know, and he's also facing, look at the last election, he had 40 opposition mayors being elected, so it's... Yeah.
Okay, Manuel, so the threats to the European model and what to do?
I think that Orban is trying to establish an alternative model, and my assumption is that this model can only work when it's an alternative right-wing nationalistic model within the European People's Party's periphery, so to say, and he is trying to establish himself as the leader of the Western Balkans because they cannot trust France, Germany, the others anymore. And today I talked to some Polish officials and I told them, don't trust this Fidesz, HDZ, EPP model because this is a Russian submarine. Yeah, because they will Gruevski is sitting in Budapest, and this was a coup d'etat organized by the Russian Secret Service. So I think that this model Orban is trying to establish to bring him a more strong position in the EPP and a role in European politics as a leader of this group of new nations and the region. But I think that PiS has an intense interest for him to not succeed, because this will be a Russian Trojan horse. I don't know if Warsaw is seeing that this way, but I think it's an argument we have to tell to your colleagues here.
I was just going to say that recently PiS seemed to withdraw from this Orban, Salvini, and Putin standing behind the curtains show. I mean, they're trying to reestablish the dialogue with European Union, which was kind of easy to predict, but they had to do other things first.
There's an argument that the cleavages are not purely East and West; they're also within the East and also within the West. Yeah, but the second question which was asked is, I truly believe that Jemek's argument to a certain extent is right. We are living in societies where almost everybody knows that he has a better social position than his parents or his grandparents. But also almost everybody knows that the world is getting more complicated, and that this privileges or this worked pensions, perhaps they might not sustain. And I think that a lot of people are individually willing to take more radical political positions to defend these privileges or earnings. But I think what is the populists doing is now, and this is why only Social Democrats should answer these questions in a classical national sense of, you will still have more, when you can see obviously that if you talk about justice on a world scale, it's not so easy to tell to everybody in Poland just you will have more and more, because it's perhaps not just on a world scale. I think what the populists are doing is interesting, because they're linking this egoistic approach of, I want to sustain, I also want that my children are living better than me, so it's not negatively egoistic, but it's or egocentric approach. They're linking it with a story of the European model, because they make this old story of the East, in the sense of the Far East, will come over Europe, the Islamist hordes will come over Europe, and everything will be gone. And if you stand up now individually, it's the last chance to defend old Europe. And they take over our values, democracy, right of women, freedom, and announce the last fight about that, so that they have the altruistic story, the narrative, for these individuals who have more radical positions because of the egocentric achievements or privileges or whatever. And I don't know if it's so easy to counter that by just saying, yeah, your privileges are right. I think it's more important to deconstruct it. Because what I think in the end is the real question about models, when I look to Russia, China, Southern America, even Mr. Trump, it is the role of the individuals. Does the individual person has a right, or are we going back to the story of, in German it's Volkskörper? Yeah, I don't know. Can you translate it, please, Piotr? So, and this is actually a story which is in Eastern Europe, in post-socialistic Europe, not new. Yeah? That the individuum is not relevant, because if you're against the state, then you can be put out from the community, because the individuum is not as relevant as the socialism. This is also not new in Germany, by the way. We had such a model also. Yeah? But I think this is the real fight. Yeah? In China, you can see in Xinjiang how much worse is an individual person. But we, of course, have also in Europe these tendencies that the individual person is not so valued anymore. In Germany, we have debates on that. In Poland, we have debates on that. And I think this is the real fight. And then one more point. When I learned about European accession stuff and enlargement, everybody always said, first came Coca-Cola to Poland, and then came NATO, and then European Union. Yeah, and so first the mindset and the mindset Coca-Cola, you know what I mean. So first the soft institutions, and then, yeah. But now we also have Yandex as a model, some people are more interested in Yandex than in Coca-Cola, or we have corruption instead of Coca-Cola, which is exported, also quite interesting. So the others are also gaining their mindset positions to intervene into us. And when I see what the Russians are doing, I mean, they are so massively successful at the short, even on short time frame, with their financing of Le Pen or AfD. Yeah, they are financing AfD. The AfD is saying in Eastern Germany, "Oh, we must be more nice to the Russians." They are winning some elections, and immediately Social Democrats and conservatives, even liberals, say the same. Mr. Macron's new position on Russia, well done by the financing of Mélenchon and Le Pen. Quite easy, you know. And I think we have to be aware of that. In our internal cleavages, Russia is investing a lot of money in splitting our societies. And this is why politicians who try to organize majorities by splitting their own societies, like I think Kaczynski is trying to do, are doing in the end something quite dangerous if we want to be not too easy to be threatened by the Russian approach. And then the second is, of course, the Chinese. I mean, China is building up a superpower which will not only diminish the rights of individuals, but also the rights of the individual nation. Yeah, and I think this is the biggest threat. But on the short notice, I think that for splitting our societies and putting also military threats on our borders, the Russian politics, not Russia as a country, the Kremlin politics is the biggest threat.
I just wanted to say that, talking about this counter-narrative, if we should build one, or maybe we should trying to decompose deconstruct the narrative of the populists. After 5 years of living in a country which is governed by the right-wing populists, we're trying in the beginning, we're trying to deconstruct it. It doesn't work, actually. It just doesn't. We really need to find another counter-narrative.
Thank you very much. One additional question before I give also you the floor for your questions and comments, because this is the very idea of the World in Focus, that we not only discuss things on stage but also give you an opportunity to contribute to the discussion and enrich it. But one final question here on the podium, because Manuel talked a lot about individualism, or maybe not individual, sorry, about individual as this category or value at the center of the European model. But I think the tendency today in Europe, but also in the world, is basically can be subsumed in the motto, the culture or cultural identity is back. And this is not about individual, but it's rather about collective, strong collective identities. And this is also the recent Fukuyama book on identity, basically defining it as the driving force of today's world. So how? And this is I'm aware that this is a $1 million question, but how to? Because if we are talking about counter narratives, so how to? Do we have any idea what a strong counter narrative could be in the age of fear, where the strong, very nationalistic, very essentialistic identities are on the rise? What do you have any ideas where to start with? Whoever would like to take the floor.
I mean, what I think is that, but this is a classical answer, that if you look at the European Union, it shows that I think that a strong Europe is defending European Union. Strong European Union is defending us better than to believe that strong nation like Poland can defend better. But then you have to really look outside. I mean, if you have the pattern for politics that we have to defend Poland against the European Commission, this is of course not functioning. But to think that the European Commission is more a threat to the Polish people than Huawei or Putin at the Eastern Front is somehow ridiculous. So I think we need to stick together in the European Union to defend us. It's one of the stories. The second is that the story of a strong nation which is defending the people who belong to it has, of course, a tradition which is, especially in Poland, also has been used by the communists for legitimizing power. I think that Szczerek is right on that. It's not enough to just deconstruct it. But of course you can use also to build up identities to have a more individualistic view on history, to have a counter-narrative. This has been tried actually. I mean, if you look to this interesting project, for example, in Gdansk of the Museum of the Second World War, which is one of the leading examples how to newly interpret history in a way of a European way and not in a national way. I mean, there are ways to do that, and I still believe that they can be powerful. But of course, in the moment, they haven't won. Yeah. And then in the end, I mean, when I talk to dissidents from former GDR, for example, or people who fled, escaped, and usually they were saying like, yeah, I had some crazy hairs, and then I had some problems with state, and this is why I was leaving. Yeah. So I think that also you can be who you are individually. I mean, not what you said, individualism. This is also a point. And we have a lot of people who cry out for that, who speak out for that, and a lot of movements for whom it's important, not only LGBTI, but also, I can make for my own sake. I can make my own success. Not other people are deciding about the future of my family. I can build up my future on my own. And I think this kind of American dream, to a certain extent, idea, is also a part of this narrative, perhaps.
I think what is part of the European, or maybe is really makes European identity, if we try to define it, it's this combination, which is not always succeed, but that's what we try. The combination of freedom, political pluralism, and democracy, let's say, with rule of law, and social solidarity. I think, for instance, if you look at the US model, they always valued freedom and economic success, let's say, but on social solidarity, welfare, Europe was always better. The Chinese model, maybe it's economically successful, but as we can see, there's no freedom. So this is something that has characterized us, and I think we all agree on the goal, but the crisis at the moment is that it's very difficult to implement. How do we economically manage to have this social solidarity? How do we finance it? This is, in France, this is the heart of the crisis of the Gilets jaunes. So, and I think it's also the problem in many of our member states. So, I think this is really something which we still have to work on, and if we succeed, this, I think, could provide a good counter-narrative if we succeed. On nationalism, what we find also is that there's this. What strikes me is that there's a contradiction between some of the populist parties, or I prefer personally very often to call them nationalist parties. So they have this nationalist narrative, particularly in this part of Europe, because it's easier to tell this narrative, because of course the national feeling was oppressed for so long. But the contradiction is that they still need to be within Europe, and they still want to have this European feeling, so or help or support. So I don't think it's so easy to I think this nationalist discourse is probably easier to deconstruct. Yeah.
When we are talking about common area on which we could build our European identity, these are very simple, small things. Also among young European intellectuals, before the notion of Politico Europe occurred, there was nothing that could build foundations for a discussion on this topic. We really need something that would create a common platform on which more people could be engaged. Of course, this is a banal conclusion, but until we have a platform, I think we are in a vacuum. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite all of you to comment, to ask questions. Whoever would like to speak, please feel free to do so. We'll collect some questions and comments. Do we have a mic, a portable mic? Yes, we do. In the middle of the room, there is a question or a comment. Please introduce yourself as well. Is it working? Good evening, Antoni Władyka. I've got the following question. I've been living in Germany for over 20 years, and now I'm living in Warsaw. And I have a question concerning social system. Well, in Germany, as everyone knows, social system does exist. It is working. If someone loses his job, is not left behind, can go to, can get some benefits, social benefits. In Poland, there is a social system, but at the end of the day, if someone loses his job, is in a very difficult situation. And the question is, I don't know if people pay attention to this fact, but in Poland, social system is weak. I think in Romania and in Hungary, the situation is similar. Do you take these things into account? Do you take into account the fact that the lack of social system can have an influence on future narrative? Okay, in Warsaw, unemployment rate is very low right now, but the situation might change in the future. We have no people to work in Poland, but in a couple of years, the unemployment rate in Warsaw might be 15 or 20 years. So when it comes to the lacking narrative, should we take into account the fact that we do or we don't have a social system? Does this have an influence? Okay, so it is a question about if there is anything, if there is something like the European social model, and is it possible for such a model to be created? The next question, in the third row. Eva Hałusko. I would like to refer to the main topic on the agenda today. Well, the European lifestyle does exist, and I fully agree with what the representative of Le Monde said today. It's freedom, democracy, and solidarity, social solidarity. I think that's the core of the European model. But I wouldn't like to make this model too narrow, because yes, indeed, there is a European model with the Greek, Roman and Christian roots, but I can't see a difference between Portuguese people and Russian people who live at Barents Strait. These are people from the same cultural system. Okay, there is a regime of Putin on the east side, but this does not necessarily mean that people in Russia strive for this European model, and people who live in Russia would like to have the lifestyle that is led by Europeans. Well, the European model does exist, and the best proof is the fact that migrants come into Europe and they do not flee from Europe. The European model is very catchy. Should we defend it? Well, we should, but not in the way we are doing it, or not in the way that lots of nationalists imagine this should be done. I think that patriotism is the opposite of nationalism, because patriot is someone who loves his nation, but he or she is open to other nations as well. And the definition of a nationalist is the opposite. I graduated from a psychology department, and every psychologist will tell you that the fear of aliens, of people who do not represent our culture, is something inherent in every human being. And that's a very catchy phrase. It's easy for this fear of others to be deepened. And how should we tackle with this fear? We should discuss things as much as possible. We should not reject others. We should show people that those others are not dangerous. They are friendly. That's something we should show to those who fear others. So the European model does exist. And the last comment, well, I fought against communism a long time ago. And in the 80s, we dreamt, or at least some of us dreamt, about the European Union stretching from Portugal to Russia. Unfortunately, Russia went in a different direction. Unfortunately, but we dreamt about it. We didn't see the differences that emerged later on. You talked about social democracy. It is lacking in Poland. Why? Well, because of the communism, because of the experiences from the communist era. There are social democratic parties emerging in Poland which are not associated with the communist times, but they are starting to emerge right now, and we still have to wait. Thank you so much for your comment. Are there any other comments or questions? Jarosława Kotwicka.
My question will be mostly addressed to Sylvie, because she was talking about social solidarity and about the common target for Europeans to, what do we want to do together? The question would be, if Europeans are basically the same culture, but they're just, different in their views and, they're right and left and everything, don't you think that we should a little bit step back to the very basics, to the unity that was there before? Because what was essentially European Union about? It was about, it was about trade. It was cooperation through trade. It was about peace. It was about, making essentials of peace and unity in Europe. Maybe we should not have these disputes about minor things which people raise. And, obviously human rights are important, and all these things are important, but maybe what will make people cooperate, what will make states cooperate, is the very basics, the very essences of every state. So why don't we focus on something that actually unites us, and then leave the rest to either, postpone it a little bit and maybe wait until democracy, reveals itself naturally, not by imposing this democracy on the nationalistic states, if you will, like, Poland and Hungary. Europe is so angry with them, and they're saying, oh, but they're in the European Union, and they, there is these issues of, abortions and migration. Why don't we tell them that, there are the basics, let's cooperate on the basics, and maybe let's negotiate about everything else?
Thank you, and Jacek Kucharczyk.
Jacek Kucharczyk.
2 points. One is I very strongly agree with what Ziemowit said about the not orientalizing the current discussions about Central European problems with democracy and rule of law. I think that it's pan-European problem, and we have it in different degrees on almost every country. It's most severe in Poland and in Hungary, there is no doubt about it. But if you look at Mr. Boris Johnson, I think that he can be characterized as authoritarian populist. I mean, he recently said that after elections, if he wins, he will have to look at the court system because courts became too political. I mean, I think he was listening to some of our politicians' speeches. So that's one point, and I strongly agree with this. And the second point, I want to comment on what Sylvie Kauffmann said about the imitation and this story that Krastev tells about basically that we in Central Europe admired the West in 1980s, then imitated in 1990s and became disappointed now. I don't think this is a true story, to be honest. And I remember very well the mindset of the democratic opposition in 1980s. I was the student at this university and avid reader of underground press. And there was a sort of across the board a feeling of missing the West, admiration, but also of moral superiority towards the West. It was very much the same people, not just right-wing conservatives, but also liberals. I mean, we were reading Zbigniew Herbert about how the West doesn't want to defend itself and is, decadent and, weak. And so there was no blind adoration for the West. And I think it had also certain significance for how we were building democracy in 1980s, and I mean especially privileging the role of the Catholic Church. It was largely a consensus among democratic opposition that we created democracy which was not really an imitation of West European models, if at all maybe American models, with the church as this kind of morally superior, but also institutionally privileged in different ways. I mean, one of the first events of the young Polish democracy was banning abortion and introducing religious instruction in the schools. And in a way, what is happening now in Poland, this conservative backlash, is a result of the fact that this consensus about the role of the church and Catholic religion became to break down after 2010, basically. And so we are now in a counter-revolution phase. So it's a very complicated story, and it's not a story about how we suddenly became disappointed. And the Polish society is very divided about values. So once again, it's not East versus West, but Poles versus Poles in this case. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jacek. I think there is a time for us to get back to you, because our time is running out. So there is a time for the last reactions from you, and I would you feel free to react on whatever you want. But I think I would like to pick up perhaps two questions which came up here in these interventions. The one was about the European social model. Is it something achievable? Is it something likely to? Because I think the whole social agenda in the European Union, the ambition to make progress on that, this is one of the most divisive issues in the European Union these days. So the question is how to understand that and how to go about this question. And the second interesting intervention, I mean, the question which was here. So shouldn't we go back to the basics, I mean, of the European integration? I think this is also very much echoed in the interventions of the Polish Prime Minister and the PIS party, that basically the European integration is mostly about trade, economic integration, and the rest is always negotiable, and we basically that the European integration has gone too far.
Clearly no. Because, I mean, Poland wants to have more integration on energy, for example, or better mobility of workers. So, clearly no. And, I mean, we have a good example from Brexit, because the Brits were employing thousands of public servants to make papers where Europe should have less competences before they were deciding on Brexit. And every of this paper proved that the competence which has been given to the European Union is quite well placed. And I think that it's quite clear. I mean, on the one hand, everybody knows that the PiS doesn't want to speak out loudly that Poland one day will have to join the Eurozone. But every time we want to make Eurozone core things, even the PiS is saying, don't go too far apart from us. Yeah? No, if you want to have a role as a world biggest economic space in the internal market, we need to have regulation which is in place, and this means details. And this is the strength of European Union, that the details of regulation are everywhere more or less the same. This is making our market strong, this is making our margins strong, and this is making our leverage high, as well as in trade as in export. And especially Poland has the biggest interest in this. and the Central European states, because actually the power horse of the integration of economics of Germany, Austria, and Central Europe is not to underestimate. And this is perhaps the second point which I would like to stress, that I cannot believe that anybody in Poland, I mean, a lot of people in Poland or in Hungary will be disappointed about the transformation and the West or the European Union, whatever, for sure. But if you just look to the facts, the transformation since 1990 of this region is so unbelievably successful. Nowhere in the world, never something like that happened. Yeah? And I think this is more or less a point. I think that there are social points to stress. And I think that with Pięćset Plus, PiS was showing exactly that if social democratic elites are getting arrogant and not minding about the real threat on poverty, that you will have a problem. But actually it's the same in Germany. I mean, we have children poverty in Germany, really a big problem, and still nothing in place tackling these problems. We are caring about elderly people a lot, but children poverty is totally underestimated, or inequality in school system and stuff like that, yeah? So for sure. But what I think what is more explaining the success of new nationalism in general, not only in Central Europe, also at us, is the new national pride of the successful ones. Yeah? 20 years ago, 10 years ago, to be successful, you had to first make a bar job in London, and then perhaps you came back to Poland. Today you can be successful economically-wise, live like better probably like where the Pegida is so strong, in Warsaw without leaving the country. You can be economically de facto rich and never leave Poland. You can be nationally proud and economically successful. You don't have to be migrant to become economically successful if you're a Pole. This is a change. So the transformative power, the success, also is bringing up a new, not per se nationalism, it can also be, I mean, Poland has all reason to be proud on this new strengths and the new economical power. But it can also bring a new story, you know. When I was in some Polish village some 15 years ago, somewhere next to Sielce, and we were drinking with some people, 80% unemployment, and really great people, and everybody of them was going to Germany or to France for work. If somebody told them that in Berlin-Kreuzberg there is the Sharia taking place, they would have laughed because they were all on working places there. But if you look to the young people in Poland now, a lot of Poles are not going anymore abroad, perhaps for some parties, but, you know. So what I want to say is clearly that the adoration of the Poland becoming a normal country, Hungary becoming a normal country, being successful, being integrated in the working production chain of European Union, this is making Poland to becoming a bit more normal like Germany before, or like France before. Yeah. So I think that we have to cope with that. The social point, I think it's important. What I think it's interesting, if I go to Georgia or to Armenia or to these countries at the margins of the European Union, a lot of young movements are establishing there, calling themselves social democrats, to be the new guys who change politics. Also on the Western Balkans. And I'm agreeing, and for me it's quite funny to call yourself as a progressive movement social democrats. I don't know why, perhaps I have too much our German social democrats in view. But I think that the social point is important, but for really changing a post-socialistic society, for example, I think that the only argument of social values will in the end not be enough to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Manuel.
Yeah, these are all very difficult questions, but I'll try. On the basics, I think this will come by the force of events. If you go back to why the European Union was created, one of the main factors was France and Germany, right? It was if you realize that that was done just a few years after the war, I think this is really something which is extraordinary. And France and Germany sometimes still, and very often still, have a difficult relationship. It's we can see it at the moment. It's a cumbersome process, but on the other hand, they're never giving up trying to. I mean, they can't give up because they have such an intertwined existence now, the two countries. I'm personally totally fascinated by this phenomenon of the Franco-German relationship because it's no, it's really quite unique in history, I think. But anyway, so this it's the in a way it's the force of events and history which makes us work together. And I think the world, what is surrounding us now, is also going to bring us back to basic, like climate change, for instance. Climate change. No country can fight this on its own. So and I think Europe has had a lead on this, and it has to continue or to take it back. We were talking, when I was talking about digital earlier, I didn't mean just to have, modern operational digital tools, but it's also when the way we use private data. Look what's happening in the US. Look at what's happening in China. In China, your personal data are owned by the state or the party, whatever it is. In America, it's owned by big companies. In Europe, we're trying to set up another model, which is that we should own our private data. This is what Europe has to do together. So I agree with you. We have to go back to basic, and the basics in a way have changed because the world has changed. So, it's also more difficult to do this when you're 27 than when we were 6, right? So, again, it's a bit of the burden lays on the politicians, probably, and on the citizens. But it's still, of course, also on the journalists, who bear a lot of responsibility in all these problems. I know, but also. I was struck earlier by statistics I saw on Twitter. The Eurobarometer today published its report on the public feelings on the euro. So we have the impression that the economies in the eurozone are, not going well. It's the growth is not fantastic. I mean, we are always focusing on our difficulties. 3/4 of European citizens in the Eurozone think that the euro is benefiting them. So it's the highest approval rate ever since the creation of the euro. So, if this is not a success, what is it? We went through this terrible euro crisis and still people think that this is a wonderful tool. So, it's something to take into account. And just on the social model, of course, every country, solidarity. Of course, every country, is running it according to its a national competence. And I agree, social Europe doesn't exist. But I think the criteria, again, are still quite common to all of us. I mean, that's my impression.
Szczerek, last word.
I just wrote a book on Hungary, and when I came to Hungary in 2015, that was like the year when peace came to power. Orban was already governing Hungary for 5 years, and I was actually my reactions, my trying to explain whatever I see there while talking to people was very similar to whatever you guys say right now. I mean, it's very nostalgic to listening to how, for example, you cannot understand. Well, the most of people claim that euro is benefiting them, so why the fuck? Well, the thing is, it's always active minority contra passive majority. The thing is, we really need not just deconstructing the populist narrative. It's not just trying searching for all the WTFs. Why people are doing that? Euro is good for them. The lack of borders is good for. I mean, we need to make those 70%, which is not 70 anymore, by the way. It's shrinking. We have to make them active. And this is how I would like to refer to whatever you said about the social system. I mean, I don't know if Europe can afford it right now, but something like a common European welfare system, this could be like a beginning, the kickstart of this I don't know, new agenda. Because like, okay, like I see, for example, right now that peace is slowly turning back into the European path, that Ursula von der Leyen is, trying to get in terms with Morawiecki, and Czaputowicz is trying to clean up after Waszczykowski, and all these things are really happening. And I have hope when I listen to the new European Union elites. Still, I do not see this kickstart thing. I mean, like, we really need to counter. We are really in a very, very big need of the counter narration.
Piotr, may I say one thing? Because
just one.
I think there's one right point where you said the politics have to make it, and I want to agree now, because the euro is the best example. In no country on earth you would win a referendum on kicking down the national currency and bringing the euro, except in Kosovo and Montenegro. But in no country, and also not in Germany, you never would have won this. You needed politicians who do it, even if you have a majority against, because they know it's right, and they just counter populism by doing it anyway because it's the right thing. And this is something which is clearly valid for Poland regarding the euro, I believe, and then, of course, do it in a social just way. But it's also valid for Germany, because usually, the Germans are going to the debates on Greek crisis and saying, oh, let's be realistic on the euro, and it's so costly, and the debate on the ECB politics is really bad. And then we go to Poland and say, why don't you love the euro? Romantic, And this is also, we always want the others to be romantic, but if we look at these topics, but it must be, the money must also be accounted. So you need politicians who have not only short sight, not only next elections in sight, and then who counter populism by doing it in any way and explaining it well. And this is what I wanted to say.
Yeah, so thank you, Manuel. And I think we started with the question about the European model and ended up with, this fundamental issue of political leadership, which is probably also important when it comes to the definition of what the European model is or could be. And I will not disclose any secret by saying that the idea of this panel was not to give you an ultimate answer to the question, what is the European model? We were not as ambitious. The idea was rather to raise a few questions and in the first place to make you interested in other panel discussions taking place tomorrow in the framework of the World in Focus conference, where many issues we have just touched upon here, the Kremlin and the European far right, the Franco-German relations, multilateralism, China and many others will be addressed separately. So I encourage you very much to attend tomorrow's discussions. I would like to thank very much Sylvie Kauffmann, Ziemowit, Szczerek and Manuel Sarrazin for this very interesting discussion. I would like to thank you for the attendance, for your interventions and for your patience with us here on the panel.